So, ladies and gentlemen, our Chair Liu's and Vice President Fong, today's is our very exciting days because we're going to talk a very exciting topic. Before we start today's topics, I would like to let you see, actually, in Chinese philosophy, Zhuangzi used to say, in 秋水篇，井蛙不可喻于海者，居于虚也；夏虫不可喻冰者，笃于实也；趋势不可喻于道者，述于教矣。It's so hard for me to remember that. Okay, that means in English that means you cannot talk to the frog in the whales because it's a limit of time. You cannot talk to the summer's insects because about what is the ice, what is winter, feeling of winters because of limits of time. And you cannot talk to the people, local peoples about the two Dao in the way in Lao Tzu's ideas, and because the limits of education. And because this limits of time, limits of space, limits of education, usually is limits of mind. It is the burdens, it is broaden horizon of your mind, broaden your view of futures and life. So today we feel very honored, and it's also my great pleasure to introduce you our Vice President Fong. To me, he's the man of visions. He sees the futures. We have quite a few talks, and I always have strong feeling to his charisma, not only to what he says, but also how he says it. And today he's going to give an excellent talk on Google, my late fathers over India, China, and United States. What may happen in 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, big hand to Vice President Fong.
Good morning. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to come to speak to the students of NCKU. First of all, I want to thank my friend Vice Lai and also my friend Professor Liu Haibing for inviting me to this speech. I really am very honored to have the opportunity to be one of the speakers of this remarkable and outstanding lecture series in NCKU. I have chosen to speak on a topic which has profound implications for me personally, and partially I think we can all agree that the interactions of these three nations that are outlined in the title can and will have profound implications for Asia and for the world. Actually, in order for me to prepare this speech, I served the website for the English Ego Project, and the first thing I saw was the following mission statement. So allow me to read it here. The NCKU Envision, the World Lecture Series, is part of the NCKU English Ego Project, whose aim is twofold: to create a life-wide English learning environment where classrooms, online, and campus English learning resources are integrated and to motivate students learning beyond the classroom into other learning contexts, so that such experiential learning enables students to achieve the aim of global villager development. The lecture series provides the opportunity for students to consider the world around them in perspective that will help to shape their lives. I also decided not to use the PowerPoint. I feel that these lectures have several purposes. One, of course, is to discuss the issues of the title. The other is for students here to develop the skill to listen to speeches, to listen to people discussing issues of some complexity, and try to comprehend enough of the complexity from the language that was spoken and not through looking at pictures. In fact, I always say that, I don't know whether you know about it, one of the most profound speeches ever delivered by any human being, in my mind, was by President Abraham Lincoln, who did that right after a very, very bloody war in Pennsylvania. It's called Gettysburg. And the speech was probably less than 150 words. And it was so deep and so profound. Can you imagine that he had to use PowerPoint to deliver it? And so I think the ability to listen, to learn, to listen to speeches without visual aid is an important part of your learning process. Because if you cannot do that, then you cannot penetrate into other people's mind when they speak. And that's what you need to do. You need to penetrate into other people's mind. And so I hope that this is one of the reasons why I decided not to use PowerPoint. I want to congratulate the organizers of this project who was able to write so eloquently about the mission. As one of my friends would say, I violently agree with you. For NCKU to truly become a globally minded university, we need this sort of forums more and more, and often and more often. Now, you think about the title that I have given to you, I have to apologize first that A, I'm not an economist. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not even a philosopher. I'm merely a theoretical physicist who happens to be born to Chinese parents in India, received all my advanced education from undergrad to grad to postdoctoral fellowship in the United States, and eventually developed my career in the United States, and during that time visited Asia-Pacific region for the past quarter of a century for over 130 times. And now I'm actually living in Asia, living and working in National Technical University. So I actually walk the walk, so to speak. So my view about this issue is not coming from an expert in sociology, an expert in philosophy, an expert in political science. I'm coming merely from a person who just happened to experience something that few have experienced. So it may be what the Chinese would refer to, in fact it was brought up earlier, I could be the Jing Bi Zhi Wang, or the view of the sky from a frog at the bottom of the well. All he sees is a circle. It so happens in October of 2005 at the annual convention of Indian Institute of Technology, North Texas Alumni Association. As you probably know, Indian Institute of Technology, or IIT, is a set of really truly remarkable universities in modern India. And in fact, this is what I refer to, picking up the title from a movie called The Magnificent Seven. I refer to them as the Magnificent Seven. And I was invited to give a talk, which I actually used the original title, which is India, US, and China Tripartite, or Trinity, in the 21st century. My fundamental belief is that how pivotal these three nations will be for the world in the 21st century will depend very much on how the intertwined relations between them. So allow me to share something with you that is deeply personal, and I believe has profound implication in what we are discussing here today. I mentioned earlier that I was born in New Delhi, India. Besides the obvious reason why I was born in New Delhi, India was, of course, because my mother was there. She was actually, that's a joke, I didn't. You know, you have no choice as to where you're born. You're born where your mother is. That my mother, who happens to be an American-educated pianist, was there at the time, and the whole family was there because my father was the foreign correspondent for the China's Central News Agency, Zhongyang. He was the chief of the English editor. And a few weeks after my speech in 2005, my father happened to receive the Doctors of Jurisprudence from NYU in 1937. And in 2005, my son actually got accepted by NYU to study law school. So I always say that there is my father, high IQ, there's my son, high IQ, something happened in the middle, there's a drop in the IQ. So when he went to the interview, he dug up the information about my father, or his grandfather. Now, my father died a long time ago. He died in the early 50s. So after a while, after all these years, he seldom entered my mind. So my son's action actually triggered my interest in my father again. So after a few days of my son's action, which was a Saturday morning, I usually would sit leisurely in my armchair in Dallas. I would surf the net. And suddenly, I thought, maybe I should Google my father, which I've never done before. Now, I'm not sure how he spelled his name in English. And at that time, I still didn't know how to put in Chinese words. So I just typed in Paul Thang and India. I expected nothing from that. After all, he died long before internet were even a concept, never mind being something that we operate day to day. And what came out knocked me off my chair. And I would have to say, hooray to Google. It's deserved all the stock price it gets. Now, the result of Google search produced the following website, and I think you have it, and I urge you to take a look at it. It's actually remarkable to look at it. In it, it contains a mesmerizing article by an author who's actually a well-known Indian journalist called Manoj Das. And the title was Forging an Asian Identity. And it was published in the Indian newspaper called The Hindu on January 7, 2001. And the entire article is absolutely worth reading, and I urge you to read it, because it will open up your horizon if it's not already opened widely. And I'd like to share that little piece of it here with you. And it says, we meaning people in India, and this was written by Manoj. We in India have debated as much as other Asian countries have about issues like the desirability of Western influence on our culture, the inevitability or otherwise, and the relation between tradition and modernity. Like the May 4th movement in China, which championed Western values and ideas in the 1920s, we too have voices against our traditions that was given a reasonable hearing. An exchange in experiences of this kind would no doubt be highly educative. For quite some time, Indian literature for the common Englishman meant what Rudyard Kipling, who was a very famous poet, and the like, wrote. For long, Indians' window, as well as that to the West and Chinese life, has been pearl as bud, 赛珍珠, good earth. And when I read Lu Xun, a member of his short stories and the true story of RQ Zhenzuan, I realized that despite the realism of the works of Pearl S. Buck and other gifted writers, Lu Xun's work had an authenticity that could be expected only of a native of China. I do not propose to display my meager knowledge of Chinese literature here, but what I propose is a strong and well-planned academy of Asian literatures to take care of the great need to know one another. And who could take that effective step in that direction? For me, that means Manoj. The answer came from the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, the following passage knocked me off my chair. Speaking to Paul Feng, this was how Google picked it up, of the Central News Agency, he, namely Nehru, said on January 20th, 1946, if China and India hold together, the future of Asia is secure. The holding together need not be confined to diplomacy. It can, by all means, be a psychological force that can work wonders in the realms of creativity. Those 12 words uttered by Nehru, I think, defined almost what's happening in Asia in the 21st century. So I said in the IIT speech on October of 2005 that in preparing this speech, I realized that it must have been my background that the organizers were zeroing in on. The more I thought about it, the more I am convinced. Indeed, I'm a product of these three great nations, and so I may have some unique personal perspectives about them. Having read about my father now, I'm even more convinced. That is why I was at the conference in 2005 in Dallas, and why I am here today. I should also mention that all of you have heard much about these three nations on a daily basis. India, US, and China, or what we call mainland China here. And someone once told me that this is actually interesting, if not the constant claim in the United States now that China and India are taking all the jobs away from Americans, all the international news in the United States would be on global terrorism. It's actually quite ironical, I think, maybe even a little amusing, that the bad news from China and India is bringing some mental relief for the general population in the United States. Can you imagine that every morning you wake up, you turn on CNN, and you hear about Iraq's war until you go to bed at night? It is demoralizing. Still, there is no doubt that the 21st century United States interaction with India and China will continue to increase in depth and in complexity. Also, unlike 20th century or the centuries before that, whenever you have 2 to 3 powerful nations, wars inevitably will break out. I do not foresee the day that US, China, and India will have wars. If nothing else, the way businesses and intellectual exchanges that will be discussed extensively in this conference and right here would bind the nearly 3 billion people from these 3 nations, or nearly half the Earth's population on Earth. Wars would be unthinkable. Then if there were no wars, then there must be peace. If there is peace, then the people of these 3 nations must think of ways of not just coexisting, which in English has a great word to describe such coexistence. It's called tripartite. But exist together for the benefit not only for themselves, but for humanity in general. Another beautiful word, Trinity. So let me tell you a very short form of my life to try to convince you that India, US, and China should and can be a trinity than a tripartite. As was mentioned earlier, I grew up in Singapore, and my parents sent me to Chinese schools. That will explain why I absorbed so much traditional Chinese culture. In fact, the elementary school I went to was organized, not surprisingly, by Kuomintang. And every morning before class began, the entire faculty and students in the athletic field will have to sing the national anthem of the Republic of China, which by then only had sovereignty over Taiwan, Jingmen, and Matsu. And the traditional 3 bows, San Qi Gong, to Guofu, Sun Zhongshan, as well as to the Republic. Now, Singapore happens also at that time to be a British colony. So that makes me a British subject. For this reason, education in Singapore, even Chinese schools, would have English as a subject. It was in learning English that I had my first real experience or real exposure to India. My first teacher in English was a jovial gentleman of Tamil descent, and his name is Abishdanathan. I remember that besides being a great teacher, he taught me the rudiments of this very difficult language. He was also enormously proud of his heritage and culture. Now, in my first year in high school, senior high school, something horrible happened. war broke out between India and China. Now, the conflict was still quite far from Singapore. I remember that there was still a great deal of anxiety about the outcome. Unfortunately, and understandably, there was also demonstration of nationalism, both from Chinese and Indian communities in Singapore. I am sure, while Nehru, as I mentioned, the first Prime Minister of India, was able to foresee the grand Asian picture, this war between these two Asian giants broke in. And soon after, he died. I then came to the United States after high school and became thoroughly Americanized. Several things happened in the past few decades that while on the one hand I became more and more American, I also became more and more aware of China and India. First, no sooner after I arrived in the United States, China detonated the first atomic weapon, the first atomic bomb. As you may have noticed, I said nothing about China after I arrived in Singapore as a young man, a young boy, a young child. And the reason was simple. There was virtually no news about China in Singapore at that time. China was de facto a black hole. Therefore, the fact that China was able to explode a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced atomic device, which required a lot of technical knowledge, was certainly an eye-opening experience for me. Second, throughout my graduate school days as a physicist, studying for my physics degree, many of my fellow students came from India. Outstanding institutions in India, such as the University of Delhi, Banaras Hindu University, don't you just love that name? University of Calcutta, Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, and the Shah Institute of Nuclear Physics in Salt Lake outside of Calcutta, started to enter my psyche. I was both pleased and excited to learn about the fact that India, the country of my birth, has a large number of outstanding universities. Now, as I became more and more educated in physics, I began to learn about how great science flourished in India well before many other Asian countries. Perhaps the most remarkable Indian scientist, who was the first Asian in science to win the Nobel Prize, in fact it was in 1930, was Sir Chandrasekhara Venkata Raman, R-A-M-A-N. I should mention that the next Asian who received the Nobel Prize in physics was Hideki Yukawa, Tangchuan Xiusu, in Japan, 19 years later in 1949. The first two Chinese, and only after they received their advanced education in the United States, were T.D. Li, Li Zhendao, and C.N. Yang, Yang Zhenming in 1957, 27 years after Raman. It is interesting to note that the byline of Raman's prize, and you can get that if you go on www.nobel.se and look for Raman, is for his work on the scattering of light and for the discovery of the effect named after him. I think there is not a single scientist in chemistry, biology, or any other science of today that would not know what the Raman effect is. So nearly every scientist today would know Raman effect. And perhaps in my mind, the most remarkable achievement of Raman was that he received his entire education and did his groundbreaking work in India. If you have not done so, I would urge you to read the Nobel acceptance speech of Raman, which you can just go to the Nobel's website. It is the most heartwarming scientific writing, and Raman did it without a single equation. By the way, I was asked to review a proposal recently by one of the funding agencies in the United States, and I rejected it immediately because the person wrote Raman effect, R-A-M-A-N effect, was spelled Ramen effect, R-A-M-E-N. So I said that anyone who could not tell the difference between great science and noodles should not be funded. One should remember that while the accolade belongs to Raman and Raman only, it must be underscored that great scientific achievements are seldom solo performances. Raman's achievement must imply that India's scientific conditions, while it may not be the same level of robustness as Europe when Raman was doing his work, the culture of world-class scientific research must be prevalent for him to achieve his greatness. Therefore, if one fast forward to today, it should not come as a surprise that India's technological prowess did not grow from that year. It stood on solid ground. Third, perhaps one of the most memorable moments in my life in the United States before the morning of 9/11 was on a cold day in January of 1972 in Beijing. I was watching TV in Minneapolis with awe when President Nixon descended from his Air Force One airplane with his hand protruding in order to shake the hand of Zhou Enlai. Comparing this with what happened in 1954, when United States Secretary of State Dulles refused to shake the hands of Zhou and deeply insulted not just Zhou, but all Chinese. The single gesture of Nixon was certainly one that initiated the thawing of icy relations between these two great nations. As we all know, the Chinese open policy began after the fall of the Gang of Four in 1977. In these 30 years, the world was transformed. Technologically, especially information technology, profoundly and fundamentally. In hindsight, having enormous population in China is almost 1.4 billion now, and India 1.3 billion now, how can one not expect that these two nations will not be transformed and impact the world? 1976, as we all know, was a defining year for modern China. Mao died on September 9th, followed immediately by the spectacular collapse of the so-called Gang of Four, thus bringing closure to 10 painful and devastating years of cultural revolution, and ushered China into a new era. I am sure historians will undoubtedly consider the new era as the miracle of the world of the 20th century. In 1976, China was at the verge of a complete meltdown, economically, technologically, intellectually. Having quarter humanity and a land size spanning nearly half of Asia, such a meltdown would have horrifying global implications. Yet, no meltdown occurred. Why is that? Well, one of the fundamental reasons, at least in my mind, as to why no meltdown occurred, was due to the Herculean contributions of tens of millions of Chinese intellectuals in their darkest hours, enduring the hardest of hardship and suffering the deepest personal humiliations. Their family, their professions, they still maintain palpable hope for themselves, their family, their professions, and China in general. Indeed, even without personal liberty, both physical and mental, they remain important pillars of the nation, holding up its dignity and searching for dim light at the end of the long and dark tunnel. The current state of China and its impact on Asia-Pacific basin is in no small part due to these brave individuals. I think we would all agree that China in the 21st century is fundamentally a different country from the days when the communists first took power in 1949. India, in the past 2 decades, also has transformed, or some would call it reinvented. China of the 50s gave the perception of fear. Indeed, when I was growing up in Singapore, what we were constantly reminded was China's red menace. India in the 50s gave the perception of a desperately poor third world country. Today, the perception of China and India are nations profoundly interested in becoming, and probably are, economically strong and intellectually robust. As I see it, China and India in the 21st century have at least the following challenges which did not exist in the 50s. First, there are unquestionably vast increases in international commercial activities. While there were none in the 50s, and considerably less before the 90s, the amount ballooned significantly in the 90s and beyond. With a large internal market and large and reasonably well-trained workforce in the hundreds of millions, one would expect that there will be no slowdown of this trend. Second, while the percentage is still small, but because China and the Chinese and Indian populations are so large in absolute number, there are now sizable middle classes, and they are growing rapidly. For example, for China, even the middle class makes up as little as 10% of the population, which I'm sure would be an underestimation. In absolute number, it's 130 million, which is a third or half of the US population. It is well known that middle class will demand a better environment, better health care, better education for their children, and a higher standard of living. All of these demands will place significant pressure on China's and India's soft and hard infrastructures. There is no doubt in my mind that this sector of the population will significantly impact both nations. Third, for both nations, there is a growing private sector, and it is undeniable that the wealth in the nation is slowly flowing into the hands of that sector. In India's case, it is obvious. In Chinese case, my interactions with China in the past decade, I find the percentage of my friends who work for or start private businesses are increasing quite rapidly. For example, I was told that as high as 80% to 85% of the wealth generated in Zhejiang province now are in the hands of the private sectors. These are welcoming signs, not just for China and India, but for the world. Fourth, fast and at times uncontrolled and unstructured economic growth can bring undesirable or even dangerous elements to the society, such as degradation of the environment, shortages of the necessary resources to propel the growth, and worse, the tendency to cut corners. These issues are will significantly lower the quality of life and could lead to conflicts, national or international. Fifth, as in all modern nations in the 21st century, one should not rely on the inherent human instincts to be ethical. An ancient Chinese saying is that 人之初性本善, human at birth is ethical. Whether this is true or not, I argue that we should not take this chance and see how each of us may turn out in real life. To this end, modern nations must be nations of law. Some recent spectacular examples in the corporate and academic world, for example, in the United States or in Korea, is telling you that we have this problem. And the so-called Sarbanes-Oxley compliance coming out from the U.S. House clearly indicate to us that ethical indoctrination should never be left to the individuals. So, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot help but think a little blue sky at this point of my speech. So if we look around the globe in the 20th century, perhaps the most interesting political and economic development is Europe. Before World War II, nations in Europe have different cultures, languages, and political systems, had bloody conflicts. Wars between these nations were absolutely bloody, and it was protracted. Yet, after World War II, with the Marshall Plan from the United States and with the recognition that united we stand, Europe Union, or OMAN, was created. So, can we think that in the 21st century, that would actually be an AU, or Asian Union, or Yaman, after all the French and the Germans, who were bitter enemies before World War II, decided to be proactive parts of the European Union, and with US closely aligned with that concept, European Union was created. So can one not have nations in Asia, encouraged by the two giants, India and China, working closely with the United States to form the Asia Union? Imagine that perhaps one day in the future, maybe in your lifetime, a person can actually hop on a bullet train in Seoul, Korea, and will get to Mumbai, India, without having once shown his or her passport to anyone. Imagine the improvement of the quality of life for all people in the world of Asia and in the world's population, propelled by India and China, assisted by the United States, and become the Asia Union of the 21st century. Imagine. Now that I'm in Taiwan, I feel compelled to tell you some of the truly interesting views I have accumulated and maybe developed in the past 9 months. In particular, how does Taiwan fit into this picture that I have just mentioned, or does it? You might think that India having a population of 1.3 billion, China 1.4 billion, and United States 0.35 billion, there is no role for Taiwan in this vast landscape. I think you would be absolutely wrong. I spent the last 9 months here at National Cheng Kung University, and I just realized that since I started to travel to Asia after 1980, which resulted in far more than 100 trips of Asia Pacific, China mainland, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, what I learned, saw, and sensed were in no way comparable in breadth and depth to what I learned, saw, and sensed in the past 9 months. So let me take you on my thought process about the position of Taiwan now that I have some personal experience here. As you can see, as a theoretical physicist, I was taught always to find suitable models to guide my thinking process. And throughout my speech, you must have noticed that that was my modus operandi. Now, in placing Taiwan in the Asia-Pacific context, I think Europe is again my guiding light. As I mentioned earlier, the big four in European Union today, France, Germany, England, and Italy, were involved in two of the world's bloodiest wars in the 20th century, World War I and World War II. It is no wonder that certain amount, and maybe a lot, of profound distrust of each other exists between them, even today. In the entire 20th century landscape, which remains true in the 21st century, even with today's European Union as a political entity, these nations still find each other untrustworthy. And therefore, they were always looking for a neutral place among them. That is a basic desire. The neutral place they found is called Switzerland. It is no wonder that throughout World War I and World War II, Switzerland remained neutral. And today, it is still not in the European Union. Yet, when Europe, certainly dominated by the Big Four in 1954, wanted to create the world's largest and most advanced research center by pouring resources from these countries into that center now called CERN, C-E-R-N, or in French it would be Organisation Européenne de la Recherche Nucléaire. It did not select London, it did not select Paris, it did not select Berlin, nor did it select Rome. What it did select was Geneva. Once again, neutrality, a place where the Big Four can feel comfortable, won the day. Indeed, in the second half of the 20th century, and I'm confident it's even true in the 21st century, Switzerland will continue to play a critical and fundamental role in the development of Europe as a political and economic powerhouse of the world. I think you can now see where I'm going. There are, of course, critical differences between Europe and East Asia, yet there are also similarities. For example, there are also the big four in Asia Pacific: Japan, South Korea, mainland China, and the fast-rising Vietnam. I included Vietnam because everyone now knows that it is the fastest growing economy in Asia today, even though it is one country that suffered the most recent brutal conflict, first with the French and later with the United States in the second half of the 20th century. During World War II, the big four in Asia also engaged in exceedingly bloody conflicts. Distrust or even hatred still exists in many quarters, although fortunately not all, even to this day. In this landscape, Taiwan is sort of an oasis. For example, despite the more than half a century of Japanese colonization, relations between Taiwan and Japan remain tranquil, if not warm. It is well known that because of the brutality of Japanese colonization of Korea and the brutality of Japan during World War II, among its neighbors, there is deep, deep, deep suspicion of Japan, even today. I cannot foresee the day when Japan can decrease or reduce this suspicion by itself. The behavior of the last Prime Minister of Japan, Koremitsu, clearly demonstrated that it would not be easy, if not impossible. However, Asia without strong alliance with Japan would have intrinsic difficulties. Japan, after all, is still a technological, intellectual, and economic powerhouse of the world. So I see that this is where Taiwan could leverage its good relations with Japan to be the neutral ground where mainland China, South Korea, and Vietnam can feel comfortable with Japan here. There is one major difference between Taiwan and Switzerland, and that is the relationship for Taiwan with the mainland. In the European model, Switzerland does not have a counterpart unless you consider former Soviet Union or now Russia as mainland's counterpart. However, in my mind, that is a stretch. Furthermore, unlike Taiwan and the mainland, Russia and Switzerland do not share common culture. So, it seems obvious to me that the biggest challenge for Taiwan to achieve the status of Switzerland of Asia-Pacific status is to find a way to coexist in an economic and intellectual robust manner with the mainland. Using the humor of United States culture, in this situation for Taiwan, you would call that we have an 800-pound gorilla living right next door. What is even more intriguing is that this gorilla has the same culture as you, speak the same dialect, languages, even the dialects, Hakka or Keja or Mingnan, are identical, have the same written language, except for the difference between simplified and complicated. Eat identical cuisines, drink the same potent liquor, worship Confucius, and so on, and so on, and so on. Surely, it makes every sense to find the best possible scenario to coexist with our neighbor. If Taiwan could accomplish that, and it requires very, very clever leadership in diplomacy, and more, then I am confident that the possibility is very high that Taiwan can become the Switzerland of Asia Pacific in the 21st century. And wouldn't that be truly exhilarating if that is the case? I hope I've given you my very personal, very limited, and probably highly biased view about these three nations and about Asia Pacific. I am upbeat about the future because I think nations in Asia Pacific and South Asia have deep intellectual strengths. From my personal experiences and perspectives, I believe that the United States, India, and China have far more in common than not. All are powerful nations in their own right. However, if they can only work together with mutual respect as the underpinning, and work collectively and synergistically for all humanity, the world will show a sign of relief. It is clear to me that the condition which took the entire 20th century to mature is right for these three nations to regard themselves as a trinity and not tripartite. Here I was reminded by the byline attributed to Rabindranath Tagore, who lived between 1861 and 1941, was the first Asian and Indian national and world-class poet to be awarded the 1913 Nobel Prize in Literature. And the byline reads as follows. Again, you can go to nobel.se to get it. Because of his profoundly sensitive, fresh, and beautiful verse, by which, with consummate skill, he has made his poetic thought expressed in his own English words a part of the literature of the West. And ladies and gentlemen, while these are elegant words for someone who truly deserved the Nobel Prize, there was still a suggestion of colonialism embedded in it. Indeed, Tagore was not awarded this enormous accolade because he was a great Asian poet, but that he was a great Asian poet who was able to become a part of literature of the West. This, to me, has the flavor of naked colonialization. I am confident that if Tagore were alive today and were awarded the Nobel Prize, I cannot imagine that the byline would be written in this manner. It would be absolutely unacceptable. Hence, the past 100 years are indeed epoch transformation for Asia. Due to their individual successes, I believe that China, India, and the United States, and in fact all the nations that's part of interacting with them, will need to shoulder a major part of global responsibilities to ensure that the world can be a better place for humanity in the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk. I do hope you have penetrated Vice President Wong's mind when you give the talk. And I also hope, more importantly, his talks have penetrated your mind to envision the world differently as it did to me. Now, it's question and Q&A sections. So, before we start Q&A section, allow me to remind you, if you want to raise any questions, introduce yourself first before you give your questions. Now, Q&A. Okay.
Vice President Wong. Hi, my name is Mike Lee. I'm sure you know me. I'm from the Department of Material Science Engineering. And after hearing your talk, actually I read your article before, and I have some questions. But the biggest question would be about mindset. That I was concerned about as India and China are rising. What are the mindsets they have? What are the roles they want to play in the world? And then historical difference, political difference, the biggest democracy and biggest communism in the world, and how are they interacting with each other? And then is they one under another or the other way around when they are playing a role, playing two roles in the world? The U.S. is always considered a unilateral superpower, and they are rising with big superpowers, and how are they interacting with each other? That's my question about their mindsets. To your knowledge, your understanding, even some personal stories.
Well, this is obviously a huge question, and mindset of a nation of 1.3 or 1.4 billion people is not an easy way to get to. Certainly, the mindset of the 0.35 billion people in the United States is also not easy to get to, as you can see already in the recent election debates in the Democratic Party in the United States. So, first of all, I'm not sure I have an answer to you, but I'll attempt to tell you my personal views. Whether it's correct or not, you have to decide, or we all have to decide. I believe that if you look at Asia, or certainly look at China, it's a very interesting history, because I would say that the West really started to change its modus operandi when the Renaissance, when Envision started. And and what is Renaissance? Well, to me, Renaissance is a complete transformation of the way you think. Prior to Renaissance, people don't think of methodologies in a technological and scientific way. After Renaissance, people think of that. And the people that actually, the two persons in my mind during the Renaissance that actually did this transformation, one was Isaac Newton. And I'm sure that if you've taken freshman physics, you would have the first page you would learn is Newton's mechanics. So even to this day, it's affecting you. And the second person is Galileo. These two, why do I use these two persons? Well, that's because these two persons, one was born, I think, 2 years before the Qing dynasty was started, and one died 1 year before. And anyway, they're all around Qing dynasty's beginning. Which means that while the Europe and the Western thinking started to transform from an amorphous way of thinking into a scientific methodological way of thinking, China or Asia closed its door. And those 250 years, 300 years, drove Asia into the abyss of technology. And the comparison between the Asia and the Western way of thinking grew further and further and further until the last 20th century. So, you know, you're talking about profound difference in thinking. And what is exciting to see, and then of course then there is India. India was colonized by Britain for many hundreds of years, to the point where they lost their basic confidence. Indians, until fairly recently, totally lost their confidence. To them, Great Britain was absolute tops. Nothing in India is worth talking about, even though India has tremendous historical traditions, just like China would have. In fact, some of you probably know one of our former presidents of Zhenggong University, who just passed away quite recently, Wu Jing Xiaozang, became an expert about Zhenhe, and he really showed some remarkable results about Zhenhe, and that is the technology of Zhenhe, which is roughly the same time as Columbus coming from Europe to North America. The technological difference between what Zhenhe possessed and what Columbus possessed were night and day. So, you know, those 300 years since the Renaissance truly drove the entire Asia into the abyss. And so the mentality in the 20th century for Asia, or especially with China, is of great interest to all of us, because in the beginning, as you all know, people were basically saying, the hell with Chinese culture, the hell with Chinese literature, because they were hurting us. We don't need Confucian thinking. We want to throw away all of that. And it was clear that after 100 years in the 20th century, people begin to realize it is this culture that combined with Western technology that can be probably the most powerful force on Earth, because it has tremendous synergy between technology and Confucius' way of thinking. And I think that is what the modern China in the sense of China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all put together would have to think in that manner. Because in some sense, we do share the same culture. We profoundly share the same culture. I mean, since my 9 months here, I'm convinced that Taiwan is more Chinese than China. And so try to read some of the Gongwen here, and you'll know. It is a remarkable era for us to really begin to think about how to handle humanity issues, how to be worried about the world. You know, I really like the word 天下 in the Chinese culture, which means everybody. It does not just mean China. It does not just mean, it means everybody's included. And I think that sort of thinking will be dominant in the 21st century for China and India. So I believe that this is what's going to happen. In the United States case, they have a problem. And I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem was that by the end of the 19th century, Europe, after 250 years of the Renaissance, became the intellectual and economic center of the world. Great universities existed only in Europe. If there were no, in the 20th century, World War I and World War II, Europe will today still possess the only place where great universities would be. But World War I and World War II did something absolutely profound and violent. It uplifted all the brilliant scientists, all the brilliant literature people all the musicians from Europe, especially those of Jewish descent, lifted them and dumped them into North America in 50 years. Literally emptied them out and put them all in the United States. Think of any university of today. If we just have one Einstein landed in NCKU, that would transform us instantly. And then in those 50 years, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of such intellectuals lifted out of Asia and put them in North America. Why? Well, that's because North America was protected. North America is almost like a castle with a moat around it. And that moat is called Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Now, why do I use that concept? Well, I use that concept because think of what happened in the Second World War when Hawaii was attacked by the Japanese. Now, why did Hawaii attack Honolulu and not attack San Francisco? Well, it's because at that time, the technology that existed for the Japanese Air Force and Navy were the Zeros. Their airplanes were the Envision Zeros. Those Zeros could only fly, they're subsonic, so they could only fly 300, maybe 350 miles per hour, so maybe 500 kilometers an hour. And they couldn't fly very far, so they have to be placed on aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are cumbersome big ships that needs to be protected by many, many ships such as destroyers and so on. You need a whole armada to move. And can you imagine moving the whole armada from Japan all the way to the west coast of the United States? It will be detected. It will be destroyed. It will never happen. So therefore, they could only pick off Hawaii. And in fact, even the Japanese leader, Admiral Yamamoto, knew when he did that, he said, we're done, because we have just awakened the sleeping giant. So it protected North America. It became a bastion of stability. It became a bastion of tranquility. People all over the world, smartest people all over the world, could come and work and develop. 50 years later, around 1950, American universities became the envy of the world in 50 years. However, the second half of the 50 years became a problem for the U.S. because now the world is flatter and flatter, as Friedman would say. So the technology has long made the usefulness of the moat gone. And yet Americans still live in this isolated castle in North America. It no longer is a moat. It's what we call an albatross around the neck. And when it becomes an albatross around your neck, the people start to think inward. The people no longer think of outward. People want to speak English only, for example, when they have a neighbor south of that speaks entirely in Spanish, and there's no interest on making the nation bilingual, and no interest in having. See how often we have students coming from the United States to visit Asia? Hardly any. Yesterday we were lucky. We had 35 that came, but they came only because they were Chinese Americans. And so you saw no white kids in it, 36 of them, not a single, except one, which happens not to be an American, it was a Norwegian. So you can see the mindset of the Americans. They locked themselves in North America. Think of the brutality of the government when you have to send soldiers that are totally ignorant of the Arabic world to fight a war in the Arabic world. How dangerous that would be for those soldiers. So I think that there is that mindset in North America that is becoming, I would say, the albatross of the nation. If they don't change it quickly, I think the United States will see its days having more and more difficulty. So I see that as the American enterprise, as I would call it, transformed from its days or heydays into less and less important, I think Asia Pacific will be more and more important. One of the things I think Taiwan probably have missed, and hopefully that we will correct it very quickly in the next decade or so, is to transform this island into a bilingual island. If we can make sure that every single person here, or high percentage of people here, that or every university student that come out of this university can understand its mother tongue very, very well and understand one foreign language, English, French, or whatever, this will have a tremendous impact for Asia. Because the problem with Japan is they only speak Japanese. The problem with Korea is that English is also important. So if we can transform Taiwan into a bilingual place, Singapore and Hong Kong are too small to be considered. So so I think that it is important. There are these mindsets that need to be entertained. Sorry to be such a long-winded answer.
Any more questions? So you think over the question, maybe I can have questions. Okay, actually, personally, I have observed in these two countries, China and India, for a few years too. I have been in India for twice, and China probably 10 times recently. And I have no problem with China, so we'll go into unpack the rosy horizon to come in the 21st century. But I do have a very gloomy view about India. Number one, in terms of political system, it's the biggest political, democratic country in the world. And to me, democracy is, there's two sides of one coin in the political system of democracy. And one is you have democratic way of life, the other is chaos. So I have friends who grew up in India and went to the Britain. We have class together and say, in India everybody talk, but nothing but little bit done. So in that case, there's so little progress can be made because of gigantic political system. Number two, the economic base, the infrastructures. My personal experience is much better than that in China. And number three is what with language. I see the problem of language because in India, like you just mentioned, they don't have self-confidence, especially in terms of language. I have friends who also both are professors, couples. They have to speak in English. They both are Indians, but in India, because they respect the difference, multicultural society, so each province have their own language. So they don't have kind of national language like we have in Mandarin. So they have to speak foreign language as their language. So I think language is also the problem. You want to have consensus or you want to have huge view of national visions, you need a communication. And language, I think, is another problem. And I also saw quite a few slums in lots of cities, and that's another big problem to me, is the huge gap between the rich and the poor. It's not only between the rural area and city area. Even in New Delhi, you can see the people, white-collar people with the suitcase and shoes, and work together with the beggars. And they don't feel art as a whole. This is the only thing art to me. They just feel comfortable, they work together. And I think that's the gap between the rich and the poor is also, to me, is a problem. So that's my questions. Thank you. The limits, you see, because from your talk, I see the very optimistic view, and I take a very pessimistic view of India.
All what you said is true. In terms of the rich and poor demarcation, I think that's also true in China. Although it's probably less obvious in big cities. If you go to rural districts in Western China, poverty is very, it's still obvious. I think these two nations are going to work out their own systems. I think India will figure out that their infrastructure is poor. I mean, let me tell you how poor it is. I have to travel from New Delhi to Taj Mahal, which is 140 kilometers from New Delhi. It took me 6 hours. Yeah, it is horrible. Why is it horrible? Well, you know, partially is that the roads are bad, and partially is because cows are walking. Cows are sacred, and so you're not supposed to chase them away, and so you have to wait, and so on and so forth. You know, I believe that India, with more and more higher transformation of their government, which they are also trying, will solve the problem, not now, but within the next 2-3 decades. I think you have to look at these nations in those time frames. They're not going to change like China did I organized a conference in 1992 in Beijing, and at that time there was not a single website in China. Imagine what happened in the last 16 years. And not an inch of superhighway in China. So, in some sense, the political system of China allowed the transformation of the infrastructure in such a short time. Is it always good? I don't know. You have to judge, how much suffering happened because of that. But I think by and large, it was a reasonable thing. Even in the United States, by the way, the superhighways were not created in the early 1950s because of economic reasons. Not at all. It was created for military reasons. It's because Eisenhower was very, very concerned how to move soldiers quickly if there were ever an atomic bomb attack from Russia. So, once he said that this is a military motion, the right of land and so on became a non-issue. The government came in and picked the land from people and built roads and so on. So, U.S., the so-called democracy in the world, did not do that with democracy process. So I think India will figure out how to do that too. And I'm actually confident that it will. As more and more people return to India, as the growth of the middle class in India, Bangalore right now, for example, is unlivable, even though it is absolutely unlivable. It is congested and so on, just like Beijing, by the way. Beijing is also unlivable because of the quality of air and so on. So I think that these nations will all have to figure out the way how to get to the modern way of society, how to bridge the gap of rich and poor. In that case, I truly also believe Taiwan can play a role. Because Taiwan can show, even though it's a relatively small place, it can show how this gap can be reduced. In some sense, Taiwan has more or less done that. Yes, there are still poverty in Taiwan, but not at the level of India, percentage-wise, and so on. In many, many ways, I really have great confidence that Taiwan can be a lighthouse in Asia to show people how to do things. I was terribly impressed by the last election. I thought that before the election, how cantankerous the debates were, even nasty. And yet, when it's over, it's over. The next day, the only thing that the television wants to talk about is why should why take the bus? So I thought that this transformation, this is maturity of the people, and if one just build on this level, we would have a tremendous future.
Okay.
I'm Martin from the Department of Computer Science. And you mentioned in your speech that the creation of an Asian Union under the assistment of the United States. And my question is, whether this creation will be under the interest of the United States? I mean, wouldn't this Asian Union make the influence of the United States in the world weaker? So will this be under the interest of the United States? What would be the benefits of the creation of the Asian Union for the United States? Thank you.
Good question. Actually, you have to look at history about the United States and Asia. This is something that seldom people talk about. In the 19th century, China had a terrible thing called Yihe, and then it resulted in 8 nations came back to attack China, and eventually demanded a lot of reparations from the Chinese government. At that time, it was the Qing dynasty. And of the 8 countries, which include England and France and the Germans and the Austrian-Hungary and Empire and so on and so forth, of the 8 countries, only 1 country used the money for a completely different manner. It used the money to build educational institutions, and it used the money to set up scholarships for Chinese students to study in the United States. That country is the United States. And the university they built was one of the great universities of today, which is Tsinghua University. If you ever go to Tsinghua University in Beijing, you will see this building in its main facade. When I first saw it, I said, well, I've seen this building before. It must exist, it could exist somewhere in a Midwestern university. It turned out that the architecture of that building was a simulation of the architecture of the same hall at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Because at that time, Champaign-Urbana just given that. So, you know, in some sense, Americans, maybe because of the way the country was organized, maybe because the country was born with people who still understand global humanity, want to do that. By the way, that's not just the only, and that wasn't just the only thing. I became the honorary professor of a very famous medical school in Beijing called Peking Union Medical College, Beijing Xinhe Yi Yuan. And when I visited that place, I walked in its main hall, I saw a bust of a person, and I looked carefully at the bust, and that was John D. Rockefeller. It turned out that in 1916, John D. Rockefeller Foundation donated several millions of US dollars to build the first powerful medical school in China. Think of National Cheng Kung University. Between 1950 and 1965, we here in Cheng Kung University had 15 years of tremendous support from Purdue University. Students at this university were taught by Purdue University professors. They come in and out from the United States, given on the U.S. state government grant to come to teach. I believe that the reason why National Cheng Kung University is what it is today has something to do with that effort. So, in fact, it's very interesting, this whole point. You know, why we think of Europe's growth and change is due to the United States, because after the Second World War, we have this thing called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was well-organized, and it was a one-shot deal where money was poured into Western Europe, and Germany and France and so on grew because of the Marshall Plan. In fact, what I have seen, I have seen the whole 100 years of the 20th century, if not because of the United States bits and pieces of support of Asia, we wouldn't be where we are today. It would not be conceivable where we are today. The problem with the United States sometimes is every step they move forward, they take 2 steps backwards. You know, everything they do good, then they have the Vietnam War. Every time they brought in so many students to the then they will kick out a Chen Xuesen, and I mean they just do silly things and not to let people realize that there was essentially 100 years of what I refer to Marshall Plan-like effort. So that's why I say that if the U.S. understands this, what they have done in the last 100 years, they will understand that helping another region is actually helping themselves. In fact, this is what we all should learn, is that helping our neighbor is helping ourselves. It's not hurting yourself. The world is flat. And this is how we need to think about the world. That's why I think I'm confident that as things move on, they will realize how important Asia is. And the growth of India and China will not be bad for the United States. Any more questions?
Hi, Vice President. I'm Bernard. I work for Science Museum. I would like to ask a question about India. India, as people say, India is a country with a rich spiritual mind. For example, Apple President Steve Jobs, I read his story. He said, India is a very important key to me to make myself of value to success. I become very powerful and strong in mind after coming back from India. Would you please share with us your opinion? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
My question is, why people always say India is a country with a rich spiritual mind?
Oh.
Thank you.
Well, as far as I presume your word of spiritual is a euphemism for religion. And they would argue it ad infinitum about that. And the fact that they argue, they were able to develop a very sharp way of thinking. That particular discussion led them nowhere, I'm sure. But the fact that they were able to argue was the process. So to me, it's spirituality, or euphemism, religion, could be used as a means for us to challenge our thinking process. Then, of course, it will be very, very good. I'll give you one example where between 10,000 BC after Christ, AD, to about thinking leaders. We need to promote the idea of people challenging ideas. Rightly or wrongly, as I use my Jewish jokes, the Talmudic discussion is a perfect way of training your thinking. Keep on arguing. I hope that Cheng Kung University will be such a place. I hope that the students will be arguing all day long in the corridor, sometimes about nothing. And that is still good. That is better than not arguing at all. Because it trains you to think, because you question, and anyway, thank you.
I'm arguing that India won't come up because the nature of pursuing the spirituality is for their peoples. Because Chinese people try to work hard. It's kind of deep down to our bones and blood. But Indians, they're kind of self-content people. They don't really work so hard like Chinese people. Well, that's my argument. Probably even. Okay, owing to the limit of time, final questions. Now, the Chair Liu going to see the final questions. Now the cannonball here.
Now the cannonball.
Now we have a cannonball.
Well, I'm a very humble person. So just a few comments. I want to thank Vice President so very much. Well, now I understand very much why Vice Dean Lai would say you are a man of visions. So your lecture actually, there is no doubt that your lecture has led me across time and space to see people in the past, at the present, in the future, to see people and culture in different continents. Right? But most important of all, I think what I have learned from you is to locate myself at this present moment, at this very specific site where I am now, right? And think from here, right? To think positively and act positively because of who I am and where I am. Right? And think about our own cultural heritage and start from here. As an educator, I'm thinking as an English teacher, right? As one of the co-project investigator, maybe we have to think what we can offer to our students in our English classes. More tests, right? More tests on history, more tests on geography. No, right? But we will have to follow up, right? Follow Vice President Thro's vision and try to offer you more coffee, right? More leisure time to think and to argue, right? So I want to thank Vice President Thro and hope we will all work together. Thank you.
We still have 3 minutes. Anyone who wants to see the last chance? Chance is in your hand. Actually, I'm still very curious about the position of Taiwan, the role we play in the whole international relation, and the vision you just told us. But one thing is, I truly agree with Vice President Fong is about the future of Taiwan and the role we play in this 21st century world, the global world. Because I think last year I was so surprised. A professor in Nanjing University in philosophy, he told me a group of scholars in mainland China that have been observing what happened in Taiwan for more than decades, but for their own personal interest, not for the political reason. I say why? Because they believe what happened in Taiwan now is going to happen in mainland China. So like they got to learn from us, see how important role we play. Because democracy doesn't grow with the Confucianism very well, unless there's some experiments have done like in Taiwan, and we did very well so far. So I truly agree with Vice President Fong, what he said about the important role we play, and we got to have these visions, and we got to have this self-confidence. So, ladies and gentlemen, show our great attitudes to today's speakers, Vice President Fong. Big hands. Professor Liu.
On behalf of the project and all the students here, thank you very much.
Also, thank you for your continuous support to our Envision World's lecture series. We will have another wonderful series next semester to internationalize our campus. Okay, thanks for coming today. Thank you. Bye-bye.